Hello, everyone. This, I feel, is a burning issue, a very relevant topic for Indian cities. I want to commend UMI and the organizers for picking up this topic. I am going to talk today about where the urban bus sector is today. I thought it would be useful to try and just pick up some data on what was happening before the bus funding scheme, the National Urban Renewal Mission came into being, and look at the later data, try and draw some takeaways. We are working in a number of cities, but I thought it would be useful to move beyond and look at a larger subset. The data, as you know, especially from the non-STU SPVs and new cities, is patchy. I've tried to draw it from various sources and put it together. So to the extent possible, I think it's reflective of the reality. It may not be entirely accurate in some instances. Basically, what are the trends of urbanization in India, which other panelists have also talked about, and then moving on to the trends in the urban city bus public transport area and the key takeaways. So as we all know, we are probably close to 400 million people in cities today, going up to 600, 650 by 2030, which is not too far away. The cities are already bursting at the seams. There is a huge backlog in terms of investments required in transport, because transport for a long time was not center stage as an issue for cities which were grappling with other issues. And as we move forward, note the number that the GDP of India in 2008 was almost 60% coming from the urban areas. And that's really the crux of the argument on why we need to focus much more on our cities and the investments and the productivity of these cities, and why it's important for the people, the resources within these cities, to be productive, which means that they can move efficiently from point A to B with minimum loss of time, not be stuck in constant traffic jams, which is an unproductive use of their available working time, so to speak. And going from there, I want to point you to another interesting trend that this graph shows. Between 2001 and 2011, the population in the million-plus cities actually increased by almost 50%, which is huge. Within a decade, there was a 50% increase in the population of the cities between 2001 and 11, and the fastest growth was in the 1 to 4 million bracket, surprisingly, and this is really the census data that I'm pointing you to. So therefore, takeaway, we need to start focusing on the mid-sized cities and the small-sized cities as well, because that's where a lot of the growth is. By and large, one would see that the mega cities are well taken care of, but it's really here that we are still missing some of the focus. What are the trends in the public transport? Just taking data from two very robust pieces that the Ministry of Urban Development produced in 1994 and 2007, shows very worrisome trends in the way public transport declines. Huge declines from 70% to 44% in the 8 million plus size cities, 53 to 21. I also want to say that most of the cities, other than the mega cities, maybe 6 or 10 cities which had good established public transport systems, most of the other cities didn't really have anything to begin with. Yeah? And in the absence of attractive public transport alternatives, as others have very clearly suggested, we are already beginning to see a preference for personal modes of transport, which is egged on by the fact that we have growing income levels, yes? And what are we therefore ending up with? Constant congestion, constant accidents and fatality situations, and environmental degradation. We see the air pollution in Delhi. We're also seeing the climate change kind of incidents in the weather patterns that we're beginning to encounter. So there are a lot of issues we're already now grappling with this. The document suggests that there's going to be a further 20% decline in the mode shares if we continue with a big business as usual situation. Yeah. So in 2007-8, there was maybe barely 20 cities out of 87, 500,000 plus cities in the country who had any kind of organized public transport. And even the cities or the STUs that were servicing the 20-odd cities had a very poor profitability situation. They were bleeding, fleet size were dwindling, service was growing lax. And at the same time, there was a proliferation of the unorganized public transport, whether it was shared auto rickshaws or it was minibuses or tempos or what have you. Yeah, both in certainly in the cities which didn't have any kind of formal public transport, but also you could begin to see it happening in the cities which did have some kind of public transport. And in 2006 was a landmark year when the government came out with the National Urban Transport Policy. As Mr. Ramachandran said and Mr. Prasanna, the National Urban Renewal Mission really brought the focus on urban transport center stage, and there was a huge pot of money created alongside that. Another interesting offshoot of the NERM was the bus funding scheme, which was launched in 2009, very innovatively as an economic stimulus package for the auto sector. So rather than the personal modes, it actually helped prioritize public transport. And some 10,000 buses were sanctioned in the phase 1, and then the subsequent phases. Yeah? And I want to take a minute to emphasize here that city bus systems are perhaps the most cost-effective public transport systems available and are a very good solution for Indian cities. And the second point is that they are not a substitute or a second best to rail-based systems. These systems are required any which way, whether you have a rail-based system or a mass rapid transit system or not. So these are the most basic public transport that every city must have. Now moving on to what were the trends, and basically I'm trying to compare 2007-8 to the extent possible to 2013-14, where some data is available. And by and large, fleet strengths improved quite significantly across the board. And many, many new cities, for the first time, were able to procure fleets to start a bus operation in their city. At the same time, ridership also improved, jumped up, which is a very good sign, right? Because that's what we are looking at, moving people away from other modes into public transport modes. So less polluting, more efficient systems. Bombay is perhaps the biggest anomaly where actually ridership levels decline, and there are a number of reasons which need to be, one needs to go into, including the metro system that was launched and the huge amount of construction that is going on around metro, which is slowing down the bus service. So, but look at BMTC, a jump of 1 million passengers, daily passengers. DTC, more than 2 million. Chennai, another 1 million. So very interesting jump with increase in ridership with the replenishment in the fleets. Some, you will still see some anomalies like Ahmedabad. Kolkata is a different can of worms altogether. However, in general, profitability remained negative. Urban operations have always been less remunerative. If at all, it perhaps declined a little bit. And BMTC, which for the longest time had the solitary distinction of being a profit-making STU, has also since then kind of gone under the red. Now, this is, I have this graph to show the bus public transport supply index. This is a very interesting indicator picked up from various documents. But it basically says, as a thumb rule, maybe there should be 40 buses per lakh of population in a city, right? And how do cities in general compare on that? Now, on the left-hand side, I have the more established STUs by and large, and on the right-hand side, the new services that were launched. Not always SPV, sometimes the STUs also launched new services or better services in the cities that they were operating in. So you will see, by and large, the well-established STUs are closer to the 40 mark. In fact, BMTC is way over, and because it's a thumb rule, we should not necessarily generalize. Yeah, and of course, the big metro cities were far better resourced than the smaller Ahmedabad or Pune type of cities. But if you look at the more interesting stories on the other side, we have numbers like 1.5 and 1.8 in cities like Patna and Ludhiana as the supply index compared to what they should be. These are all cities that I have put in, in descending order, with Jaipur being the highest population and Dehradun the lowest at 0.6 million. And if you look at these numbers, they are 1, 2, 5, 6, 10, which means the supply of public transport is still at very low levels in these tier 2 cities. Yeah, and that is, I think the message number one is these cities were able to launch a formal public transport service, which is great, but that needs to be now scaled up. If you look at fleet utilization, I'm moving into the efficiency. In general, I think the sense is that, you would have about 10% of your fleet, maybe 15% sometimes, which would be down and be maintained, and the rest would be out there. So between 85 to 90% is a very good number of fleet utilization. You want as many buses out there on the road and not inside and grounded, right? And you will see most of these big bus companies are doing very well on that parameter. Even these numbers have slipped because the Chennais and the BMTCs were really extremely efficient, were maybe upwards of almost 90% earlier, but we are beginning to see some of those slips also because a new kind of rolling stock was introduced, right, which came with various kinds of maintenance issues, and also the lag in internalizing new maintenance practices within these institutions. And then, of course, PMPML and AMTS have, I think historically not been that efficient. But if you see on the right-hand side, again, the new cities, Raipur and Bhopal seem to be doing pretty well, quite well, right? Most of the other cities, then there is the other extreme, which is, Jamshedpur, 0, grounded. Buses are grounded, not moving. I believe Gurgaon has still not started its bus service. Then we have Kanpur with only 30% of its fleets really out there being operated. Nagpur, 50%. Ludhiana, 44%. What's going on here? Yeah, it's kind of worrisome. And then there is a large majority of cities in the 65 to 70, 75 bracket, which still shows suboptimal utilization, very high level of issues. A lot of them, I think, related to the fact that depot maintenance facilities were generally not provisioned for when new services were launched. Going further, bus productivity, how much kilometerage does a bus do in a day? And I think experts will say, well, in urban situations, between 150 to 200 is a good number for them. It's a good utilization rate, and most of the STUs, established ones, are doing that. If you look at, again, the SPVs, it's a mixed thing. Some of them are doing quite well. Then there are others, again, a Jamshedpur, where the buses don't move. They're just grounded. There's no service. There's a Patna. There's a Guwahati. There's also a Gangtok, which are doing much less than 100 kilometers per day. And why is that? Yeah, I think there are service planning issues. There are profitability issues. there are a whole host of issues that are around this. Then we go to ridership. Everyone's interested in ridership beyond efficiency. We all want more passengers to be in buses. Yeah? And that, I think, again, if you look on the right-hand side, by and large, the numbers are, between 100 to, large majority is 100 to 400, 500 passengers per bus per day, which is a very low number, and especially for some of these 2, 3, 1.5 million size cities, which are really big cities. So why is that happening? If you look at some of the other, MBMC is a suburb of Mumbai, high ridership. Raipur is also doing reasonably okay. But I suspect that in most of these cities, there was an active, unregulated bus sector, which was in operation, whether it was mini buses, whether it was tempos, whether it was shared auto rickshaws, or what have you, whatever form. And these services were launched in competition with those. Okay. So, and then, of course, there are other issues of service planning, reliability, how these services are launched. We saw that some SPVs were doing not even 100 kilometers per day. So what's going on? Yeah. In terms of satisfaction levels, so as we would expect, the survey said 40% of the people, the users, were satisfied with the service. Less than 30% were actually dissatisfied, and there was a large 30% in the middle, which could go this way or that, right? Which I think shows the huge potential that people actually want to use it, are not quite getting what they want, but they're using it any which way, right? And if you see, the high satisfaction levels are in Chandigarh, in Bangalore, in Raipur, in Bhopal. The cities that we saw were doing reasonably well. And lower on the index is Mira Bhayandar, Kolkata, Kochi, Jaipur. What was interesting from the survey, very interesting, was that 75% of the users said that they would continue to use the service if it was improved going forward. And 65% of the non-users also said that they would like to use the service if it was improved. So that's very interesting. Why were people not using some of the candidate, the two-wheeler and other categories? They said these buses were too overcrowded, that the commuting time was too long, or they were not available in the time slots that they traveled in, right? So frequency, reliability, not enough buses out there, all of them talking about really posing that there should be more out there, more quantity of the service and better quality service out there, right? So I just want to summarize now to the key takeaways, yeah? Overall, I think everyone did well. The existing services as well as the new services, fleets replenished, new fleets created, new services launched in many, many cities, public transport, formal public transport services launched in new cities, and ridership levels improved quite significantly in the existing cities and in the new cities. Some reforms were also initiated. SPVs were created around public transport. You had urban development departments designated as lead agencies because there was this continuing confusion on whether it was transport or urban department. Profitability remained the issue, and I think that needs some serious thinking and dwell, that urban operations may not always be profitable. International experience shows that, and especially not when fare levels are so low in our context. So what do we do with that situation? I think new rolling stock, new buses, modern buses got launched, and the user feedback reflected that they liked that a lot, right? But at the same time, there were a lot of maintenance and other issues that got unleashed, maybe because technologies or those models need to be stabilized further. But what we saw was an increasing rate of breakdowns in most bus companies, and also fuel efficiency performance suffered by and large. The final positive was that the awareness around ITS solutions increased tremendously, People are aware in general there are ITS technologies available, but how many were finally successful in employing them to leverage their operations is, it's still a struggle and going forward. So overall, I think the scheme did a lot of positive and got the sector going. If you look at the new services segment, I think the new services, there was mixed results. There were cities like Bhopal and Raipur which launched their services. Good services were operated, and there was good user feedback out there. Most of them launched them without adequate planning, and so depot facilities inevitably were missing, which created a lot of problem. We've seen a huge depreciation in assets, which could have lasted maybe 8 to 10 years, but may not last beyond 5 or 6 years, probably. Service planning was also, in general, not scientific, let's say. Several cities, many cities had trouble with hiring of private operators to operate their service. And there were a variety of issues, of course, linked to the weak capacity, the kind of contractual arrangements they had entered into, which were infeasible, or a lopsided risk framework. And there are a lot of stories to tell in that entire thing. In all instances, these services were launched in competition with unorganized sector. No efforts were really made to mainstream with that, and that's a big elephant, I think, that needs to be looked at squarely in the face. Some cities have begun to start considering strategies on what can be done, which is a positive outcome. I think in general, when this came, most states and cities did not envisage that there would be funding requirements in operating the service. And that, I think, needs to be put out there squarely. And combined with the fact that these are not necessarily always profitable services, how do we deal with this whole quotient, yeah? And finally, most new SPVs or organizations that were created were done in a very limited way. There was huge under-resourcing. There were part-time resources, typically a part-time CEO or whoever created. And I think Mr. Deshmukh was telling us how there are up to 60 categories of maintenance staff alone, right, that you could have, and you should have so many. And we're talking about just main heads. You may not need maintenance staff if you're contracting to private operators, but you need a layer of management which can plan the service and ensure a good quality service out there. So in closing, Tier 2 cities have made a very good start in launching these services, but this requires very fast scale up and also a focus to ensure their sustainability. And from the sustainability, I think I just want to list out 5, 6 key items, which I don't need to elaborate on. There has to be more quantity and better quality. Yeah? And for that, we need sustainable funding. We need sustainable institutions. We need solutions to integrate and mainstream with the unorganized sector. We need technology solutions, and we need a lot of capacity building. Thank you.